And here we are once again with Schlocktober, that special time of year when the big picture brings you an entire month of episodes dedicated to some of the most bizarre monster and or horror films ever made. A tradition which coincides with my desire to lighten my fall workload with a month's worth of non-topical episodes that can be produced weeks in advance by only the purest happenstance, I assure you. So, this past summer, the American box office was rocked by the return of the king of the monsters, Godzilla, which dominated theaters and thrilled audiences nationwide for exactly one weekend, after which the film did respectable but steadily declining business and took significantly longer than initially expected to reach the magic $100 million number given its initial impact, possibly due to mitigating factors like boring enemy monsters, an uninteresting main character, the trailers having misled audiences about the prominence of Bryan Cranston, Godzilla being largely absent from his own movie, and the only interesting character having almost less screen time than Godzilla. But hey, it was pretty good overall, and maybe the sequel will be better. But either way, it was never going to match the impact of the original. Inoshiro Honda's 1954 classic was a grim allegory for the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it was also a massively entertaining genre flick and a massive hit worldwide. Godzilla was the movie that proved Japanese cinema, particularly science fiction, could have a global appeal, and just about every Japanese studio rushed to get their answer to Toho's kaiju flick into theaters during the kaiju boom of the 60s. The X from Outer Space was Shochiku Studios' big stab at a Godzilla-size hit, and it remains an interesting example of the uneasy transitional period where kaiju features were still developing the unique rhythm that would set them apart from more conventional Western science fiction. Roughly half of the film feels like a typical American space flick of the same era. The main characters are some astronauts who spend a lot of time sitting around in a spaceship.
Sano, radioactivity is increasing.
It must be solar flare activity. Doctor, cabin radiation level?
Normal level.
And then a lot of time hanging around on a moon base.
That's an apple. Does everything grow like this on the moon?
Yes. With no atmosphere, the sun's ultraviolet rays pour right into the dome.
Which sometimes looks like it might get interesting, but then doesn't. And then they're back in space again, where a UFO buzzes them and sprays their ship with strange alien spores, forcing them to land so they can study the substance, which, 45 minutes into a roughly 90-minute movie, finally produces a monster.
Look, those lights.
Yep, that's what we're stuck with in this one, and why anyone remembers this movie. Gilala, the giant space chicken. The least threatening looking kaiju ever. But at least there's a giant monster stomping around now. Gilala's thing is that he's here to devour energy and can only be beaten with a substance called gilalanium. Things proceed from there about like you'd expect.
He's shrinking.
And then the good guys win. The end.
Gilala, where is he now?
On an endless journey.
Like I said, the disconnect between Gilala looking like something that would have made Rita Repulsa decide to just take that week off, and the movie insisting that it's some kind of day the earth stood still serious exercise in speculative fiction is the main thing people remember this movie for, but they do remember it. So in 2008, just over 40 years later, Shochiku actually produced a sequel to this in the form of a geopolitical satire. Really.
Nani? 札幌に怪獣が現れた?
A monster?
Monster X Strikes Back Attack the G8 Summit was released to coincide with the actual 34th G8 Summit, and imagines what might happen if a kaiju was to attack during such an event, and the assembled world leaders tried to fight it in the same way they tried to solve other problems. Poorly. The US president wants to fight the monster to look tough, Russia doesn't want to feel left out, the German prime minister is worried about being perceived as weak because she's a woman, the French president is trying to sleep with his interpreter, you get the idea.
My name will be written in history as the president who destroyed the monster.
もし
Je veux combattre le monstre.
The summit is thrown a curveball when North Korean interlopers stage a coup because they want to launch nuclear missiles at Gilala, which has already been determined will just spread spores and make more Gilalas all over the world. But, you know, North Korea. Fortunately, a pair of reporters have discovered an isolated mountain tribe who worship an idol cast in the image and eventually played by Japanese actor, director, writer, comedian, poet, artist, TV star, and game designer Takeshi Kitano, which is prophesized to save the world from Gilala and after some coaching proceeds to do just that. And so endeth the saga of the X from Outer Space and Gilala, a movie monster that continues to cause generations of audience to say, really? I wanted to start us off soft weird this year, because I've got some real doozies lined up. Just you wait. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture. I'm gonna be honest, guys, I had some reservations about putting this one on the docket this year. See, while Schlocktober has become a brand on this show with a fairly wide definition, the root word schlock was traditionally used to describe bad films exclusively. And while Clive Barker's Nightbreed is many things, bad is hardly the word I'd use. It fits because it wears the clothes of a stereotypically schlocky movie, i.e. it's bizarre, convoluted, juggles a bunch of conflicting tones, and it's full of crazy rubber monsters. But it's also big, ambitious, clever, thematically rich, and genuinely entertaining. But, like I said, it fits the overall tone, it's topical because Shout Factory is releasing a new Blu-ray that incorporates deleted scenes into something as close as we're ever going to get to Clive Barker's director's cut this month, and it's my show and I want to do it, so we're going to do it. Anyway. Nightbreed is a horror fantasy action adventure drama about a guy named Boone who's having weirdly specific nightmares about a hidden underground city of monsters called Midian. But what's frightening him isn't Midian itself, but a sense in the dreams that the monsters welcome him there and forgive him for terrible sins that he can't recall having committed. His therapist, Dr. Decker, played by David Cronenberg, yes, that one, tells Boone that what he's feeling is repressed guilt, namely guilt at being the unwitting true identity of a masked serial killer named Buttonface, who's been carving up whole families around town. Boone tries to kill himself over this information, but instead meets a seemingly insane hospital patient who claims that Midian is real and tells him how to find it. So he goes there and, well...
It's true. Everything's true. God's an astronaut. Oz is over the rainbow. And Midian's where the monsters live.
Alright, so they don't really explain it until later, but the big idea here is that all the beings that folklore calls monsters, demons, devils, or whatever actually existed as the tribes of the moon, or Nightbreed, except they were mostly misunderstood creatures that humankind hunted to near extinction over the centuries and vilified as monsters later. What's left of the Nightbreed conceals itself in Midian, a sprawling underground city beneath a giant graveyard in the middle of nowhere. And they've got some news for Boone. He's not Buttonface.
I can smell innocence. 50 yards.
I've killed people. I've killed 15 people.
Who told you that?
Dr. Decker is Buttonface, and he also tricks the local cops into killing Boone.
I believe you.
He's got a gun!
But a bite that Boone got from an overzealous citizen of Midian lets him rise from the dead and reveals the eventual truth. He actually is Nightbreed. So he goes to Midian to be with his own kind. This is the kind of weird logic that makes the film not totally work. Even taking into account the fact that the studio butchered Barker's original plans, the script runs on a kind of dream logic that fits in with its dark fairy tale ambitions but is weirdly undercut by the film's deliberate matter-of-fact reality plus monsters, staging and shooting, though it's possible that the scope of what's being imagined simply couldn't have been achieved in the pre-CGI era. In any case, Midian and its god Baphomet are cool with Boone, but less so with his pursuant human girlfriend.
Guess he can't take the heat.
But it doesn't matter because the local cops discover that Midian exists and decides that it needs to not exist any longer.
We're going out there with God on our side.
And so we come to Nightbreed's exceedingly worthy reason to exist, a blowout third act in which monsters, freaks, and creatures of the night who are actually the good guys
Stay down! This is our home!
must fight for their lives and homes against normal humanity, as represented by an army of heavily armed, bloodthirsty redneck scumbags, a corrupt and brutal police force, and a drunken idiot representative of the priesthood, all being nudged into play by the evil Dr. Decker.
Arm yourselves for war and let them go and take vengeance for the Lord on Midian.
Sounds like we're going head-to-head with the devil himself.
The Outcasts vs. Normals business is about as subtle as a jackhammer, but the big battle is awesome, a horror version of the big, oh, F off humanity catharsis you kinda want from the X-Men movies, but never get because we're supposed to root for the peace and compromise guy instead of the vengeance is mine guy.
Come on! Don't look down!
Look what we got here.
Especially when Boone turns the tide by unleashing superhuman brutes called berserkers onto the battlefield.
Go get 'em, boys!
Now, if we want to survive, we can't hide. Brothers and sisters, it is time to fight.
Hey, how come nobody ever calls Avatar a ripoff of this movie? But though they win the day, including Boone's final defeat of Buttonface, Midian ultimately cannot be saved. Officially anointed by Baphomet, Boone is charged with leading the Nightbreed to a new safe haven in an ever more threatening world. And to further set up for sequels that would never ever come, Crazy Priest decides Buttonface is his new god and uses Baphomet's blood to revive Dr. Decker in a stupid to-be-continued climax that no one involved in the project ever really thought was a good idea. Nightbreed is one of those utterly fascinating passion projects that doesn't really work but gets an A for effort for what it was trying to do, especially given the sorry state of mainstream horror at that moment in time, and how obvious the hatchet job done by the studio was. What's most surprising today is that even after all the cutting, how loudly one of the film's implicit metaphors, i.e. coming to terms with homosexuality, comes through. You don't need to know anything about Clive Barker's own life to get the subtext of a troubled young man seeking out his forbidden true self in a persecuted underground community that at once frightens yet comforts him, and then having to protect that community from a pack of intolerant normal bullies and brutish thug cops.
What chance have we got? They're armed.
So am I.
Anyway, that's Nightbreed. Check it out, especially when that new Cabal Cut Blu-ray drops in a week or two. Next week, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. I'm Bob, and that's The Big Picture. In the preamble to this year's Schlocktober, I gave you my brief overview of Kevin Smith's Tusk and why I wasn't fond of it beyond all the normal reasons not to be fond of Kevin Smith movies. See, for me, Tusk fails not because of its bonkers let's transform Justin Long into a walrus premise, but because it's dishonestly bonkers. A movie about that would be an incredible find if it had been made sincerely, by some half-mad outsider auteur who'd sincerely and earnestly believed he was making something worthwhile out of it. But when it's just Silent Bob and his various hangers-on making the artificial version of that, based around a joke premise they thought up during a podcast, that's just the schlock appreciation version of an adult trying to imitate the way a toddler draws with crayons and expecting it to be just as cute. No, you want the real version of what Tusk was trying to be. You want the God Monster of Indian Flats, an ultra-obscure 1973 horror, western, socially conscious thriller hybrid from the early works of quixotic American artist and sculptor Frederick Hobbs, wherein the God Monster of the title is a killer mutant sheep. Yes, a sheep. Now, there was a horror comedy a few years back with the same kind of presence, but what makes God Monster of Indian Flats stand out is that it's not kidding around at all. The film is a big, surprisingly complex, and insistently serious parable of social corruption, racism, small-town politics, late-period flower child earnestness, and environmental proselytizing, with a mutant sheep monster as its central hook. You just can't fake this stuff.
This may be one of the most important scientific discoveries in history.
The film was shot in and around the mining town turned National Historic Site, Virginia City, Nevada, but actually takes place mainly around a fictionalized segment of the territory called the Comstock that for no adequately explained reason appears in the form of a kind of unstuck-in-time Wild West recreationist town, but where people actually live and work. But it starts out with a none-too-bright young rancher who strikes it big in nearby Reno, but then gets shanghaied off to Comstock, where the local organized crime racket / secret old boy society that basically runs the place robs him of his winnings and dumps him.
We don't tolerate anarchy.
A sympathetic local scientist offers to let him sleep it off in the sheep barn, where he bears witness to some sort of irradiated orange vapor engulfing and driving the sheep into some kind of frenzy, while sending him, the rancher, into an LSD-style freakout. The next morning, it's discovered that one of the sheep has given birth to some kind of mutant larval fetus, which the scientist decides to keep alive and study rather than neutralize with fire and then study because this is a movie.
Stabilize the pressure.
Pressure is stabilized at 79.6, Dr. Clemens.
Said studies eventually suggest that the orange mystery vapor was some kind of ancient toxic gas released from the town's long-ago closed mines and may be tied to legends of a terrible monster that once roamed the area. But that isn't the actual main storyline. The film cuts back to the lab every once in a while so we can see the thing getting bigger, but the majority of the film is actually given over to a sort of isolated small-town political mystery conspiracy thriller that you want to call Chinatown-inspired, except Chinatown actually came out a year after this. In this main storyline, an interloper from the big city named Barnstable is trying to buy up land around town, but the corrupt Mayor Silverdale and his lackeys in the Comstock Old Boys network want to keep it for themselves.
My property is definitely not for sale. Nor, may I venture to add, is that of my associates in the Comstock Historical Society Trust.
My client is a far-sighted and progressive man, Mr. Silverdale. He was one of the pioneers in the space exploration program. We must all move with the times, sir.
So they use the occasion of a local Old West fair to try and frame Barnstable for accidentally killing a dog.
That's right. Lie down. Lie down, dead dog. Shot my dog. Murderer!
Whose fake funeral becomes the occasion for more conspiring.
Telling you can't beat a German Shepherd for obedience.
Who could sell his property to a man like Barnstable?
How nice. A sort of instant hate.
My grandfather, the one who brought the railroad across these lands, once said to me, Charles, events have a certain logic.
Followed by a confrontation between the interloper and the mayor's dirty work henchmen. And finally, the unjust imprisonment and attempted lynching of Barnstable.
You should have never tried to escape Barnstable.
Gee, I can't imagine what this movie about a decaying small town literally stuck in the past resorting to murderous, racially tinged violence in order to prevent change arriving from outside is trying to be about, huh? And it just goes on with the pseudo-surreal cowboy town conspiracy business for so long you'd be forgiven for thinking you'd put on the wrong movie.
You haven't restored the past up here, Silverdale. You've destroyed the present.
Until an errant grenade tossed during the lynching brawl damages the science lab and the god monster finally breaks free. And yes, that is the god monster of Indian Flats, a giant bipedal mutant sheep with one elongated arm. Terrifying. It menaces a picnic full of kids. It gets dance hypnotized by a hippie chick.
Down the mountain where you'll be warm and safe with me.
It blows up a gas station. So the mayor decides to have the thing captured and put on public display, because that always works out so well.
Feast your eyes on the eighth wonder of the world!
As part of his own secret scheme to raise the town himself and hand it over to a new modern mining corporation and Wild West theme park developer.
And the Sun Mountain Railroad will run again on golden rails built by a new bonanza!
The townspeople do not take this so well.
He sold us all out!
It's a trick! He's lying!
Can't you people see what's happening?
Which leads to a riot and, well, just watch.
Violence in the name of justice controls the masses. It always has. Do you hear me, Barnstable? I've beaten you.
Say this for God Monster of Indian Flats, it's ambitious as hell, and however bewildering Hobbs' stab at genre film as surrealist, socially aware art piece a la the Andy Warhol Dracula and Frankenstein films of the same period is, the scale of the production is also pretty damn impressive, and the non-mutant sheep parts have an authentic boomtown gone bust aesthetic that speaks to the filmmakers and other participants actually having roots and backgrounds in communities like this, as opposed to the over-designed visual condescension one is apt to see when Hollywood filmmakers try to depict such places in caricature. Either way, that's the God Monster of Indian Flats. Next week, we head across the Pacific, and then also back to Los Angeles. It's a little complicated. I'll see you then. Shim Hyung-rae was one of, if not the most popular TV comedians in South Korea in the 1980s. His signature character Young-gu, who can really only be described as a Baby Huey-style adult child with a non-existent IQ and a heart of gold, was so beloved by Korean children he was able to spin him off into a successful film career. But he didn't just want to make comedies, he wanted to make effects-driven sci-fi and fantasy epics, in an era where mainstream Korean cinema wasn't terribly interested in that genre. But he pushed on, producing and often starring in, usually as Young-gu, bizarre features like Tyranno's Claw, Power King, Dragon Tuka, and the CGI-heavy remake of Young Gary, which you may have had the misfortune to see under the international title of Reptilian. But his most ambitious move came in 2003 when he announced his intention to make South Korean cinema an international force to be reckoned with by producing a gigantically expensive, for South Korea, special effects blockbuster featuring monsters of Korean mythology but set in the United States with Hollywood actors. Controversially, during the film's long production, Shim hit the domestic TV talk show circuit, making impassioned pleas not only for the public but also for film critics and the media to support his efforts out of nationalistic pride. If you didn't want his movie to succeed, you were against Korea succeeding on the worldwide movie scene, was the argument. The film he was asking his countrymen to support finally finished in 2007, Dragon Wars. Dragon Wars is one of the dumbest, sloppiest, most incoherently assembled major feature films ever produced. The kind of film that recognizable actors who somehow wound up in it, like Billy Gardell, Robert Forster, and Craig Robinson, probably leave off their resumes. About 70% of it is some of the most inept attempts at big-scale filmmaking you will ever be privileged to see. But that remaining 30%, that's also stupid, but also seriously some of the coolest shit you will ever see. We open with a big crater appearing in the middle of Los Angeles that triggers a memory in a young reporter of his childhood when an old man in an antique store told him his destiny, in the form of an ancient Korean legend. Yeah, it's one of these.
That was the light from heaven.
The light from heaven?
So, in feudal Korea, a princess was born who was destined to be a willing human sacrifice to a benevolent serpent creature called the Amugi, which would allow it to evolve into a full-fledged dragon. Until that time, she's protected by bodyguards in the form of a warrior wizard and his young apprentice, who falls in love with the girl and decides to prevent the sacrifice from taking place. Complicating matters further, there's an evil Amugi called Baraki that wants the dragon evolution sacrifice for himself and has a whole army of followers backing him up. The would-be hero, the wizard, and the princess all wind up dead, so nobody gets to be a dragon. So there. But now, for no adequately explained reason, the hero and the wizard have been reincarnated as the reporter and the old man, and that crater is the signal that Baraki and his followers have come to LA. So the chase is on to find and protect the reincarnation of the princess, who has also been reborn as a resident of Los Angeles for whatever reason.
Something terrible is coming, more terrible than you could possibly imagine.
Sarah, that terrible thing has already happened.
That's pretty much the entire plot. It's all just an excuse to drop ancient monsters into a modern city. And you know what? Ain't nothing wrong with that. Once it gets there. Unfortunately, too much of the film is spent playing hilarious hide-and-seek with Baraki. Hilarious because it makes no effort to explain how a snake the size of several city blocks hides anywhere or sneaks up on anyone. How'd he get into this suburb without being seen or heard? Or this one in broad daylight? How come no one can hear him climbing onto this hospital until the movie decides they can? Also, for something a bunch of dudes seem to worship as a god, he's kinda easily distracted from his goals. Go! Then again, the leader of his human followers works better as comic relief too.
Somebody tell me what the hell is going on!
But it doesn't matter, because eventually there's a showdown on a skyscraper. Baraki's followers show up, the LAPD, the FBI, and the Army show up, and for 10 solid minutes, Dragon Wars is the greatest achievement in the history of cinema. You got a snake constricting a building while fighting helicopters. You got fire-breathing dragons. You got magical knights riding dinosaurs. You got giant frog tanks, I guess you'd call those. You got military choppers dogfighting with dragons. You got the army in a shootout with the frog tanks and the knights riding dinosaurs. You see? That's awesome! That's like the most awesome thing I'd ever seen! And then for some reason we're in Mordor. Seriously, I have no idea where this final battle with Baraki and his minions is supposed to be taking place, but the good Imugi finally shows up. Wait, were both of these things just wandering around LA sight unseen? Our heroine decides to fulfill her destiny, the Imugi evolves, and the film arrives at its title. Dragon Wars, or just D-War in its homeland, was a massive blockbuster in South Korea, but failed to register as anything more than a cult curiosity in the United States despite a big theatrical rollout. Shim Hyung-rae, meanwhile, revived Yong-gu for another crossover attempt, this time a mafia parody with Harvey Keitel called The Last Godfather. It also failed at the US box office, but was successful in Korea. He's been pretty quiet since on the international scene.
This is not your land to dig! You have awakened them!
But yeah, so that was Dragon Wars. Next week? Oh, just you wait for next week. And so we've come to the final feature for another year of Schlocktober. Where does the time go? You know, folks, despite how it can sometimes appear, I don't collect and seek out material like this simply out of a fascination with bad movies. If bad was all it took, these would all be Nicholas Sparks adaptations. What I'm looking for in obscure, outside-the-box films is that sense of what were they thinking? Because with stuff like this, that's actually an interesting question. Not so much with more mainstream fare. Hell, it doesn't even apply to stuff that I really like. There's no what were they thinking in Captain America the Winter Soldier, for example. They were thinking, the last movie with this guy made like $1 billion, so make another one. Now this is especially true of stuff from before the age of video and at-home editing equipment, since even bad movies still took a lot of time and effort to make. So chances are if you actually finished one, even if you didn't have the talent or the skill to make it good, chances are you at least had some creative need to share an idea or vision, and when you mix that with the realm of niche and limited interest subject matter, sometimes magic happens. Case in point, this week's feature is all at once and in total sincerity a Christian film, an anti-drug message movie, and a brutally violent horror flick. And, perhaps inevitably, it's from Florida. This is Blood Freak. Our star is B-movie actor Stephen Hawks, real name Stevan Sipic, a Croatian-American beefcake who'd gained minor notoriety making unlicensed Tarzan movies for Spanish producers, portions of which were shot in Florida. During the production of 1972's Tarzan and the Brown Prince, an on-set pyrotechnic accident led to Hawks suffering serious burns over 90% of his body, requiring him to stay in Florida for extensive skin graft and therapy while the production moved back overseas. Still recuperating and needing money, he signed on to make Blood Freak for infamous Floridian low-budget filmmaker Brad F. Grinter. Hawks stars as a macho biker named Herschel, recently back from Vietnam, who meets a very pretty and very religious girl named Angel, subtle, who offers him a place to stay. Said place is also occupied by Angel's sinful sister Anne, who likes to hold drug parties with her dealer and her hippie friends. She'd like hunky Herschel, who kinda looks like Elvis if he were a He-Man toy, to join the fun as well, but he's more interested in learning about the Bible from Angel than drugs.
Go ahead, turn into a Bible freak. See who gives a damn.
Anne, please.
Why don't you let the guy do what he wants to do?
You know, I've been in the midst of this same debate a few times, and it's never been two hot chicks. Just saying. Anyway, Anne scores some weed that turns Herschel into a total addict in about 30 seconds. And then she seduces him, so too bad for Angel, huh? And it's kinda crummy on Herschel's part too, since she went to the trouble of getting him a job on a turkey farm, which turns out to actually be run by mad scientists who are testing chemicals on turkey meat and want Herschel to be the human guinea pig to see if it can be eaten safely. Their logic literally being, well, he's built like a brick house, so he's probably safe. Unfortunately, he is not. The tainted meat transforms Herschel into the Blood Freak, so named because he is driven to drink the blood of fellow drug addicts. Alright, you know what? Not a bad idea for a monster movie. Except... Yep, you ain't seeing things. The Blood Freak is a half-man, half-fowl were-turkey. Unless you think they're joking around, the director himself occasionally interrupts the movie to speak directly to the audience about how serious the film's intentions are.
Any man who could refuse such temptations from such a girl as this, he would have to be much less a man than Herschel. How bad is that? But remember that the paths of life are predictable, and we repeat them again and again. Right on.
So, the Blood Freak goes around abducting drug users to drain and drink their blood. Well, in a bizarre subplot, Anne's drug dealer boyfriend attempts to pay off his supplier by letting him rape Anne, a crime for which the Blood Freak literally takes him to the woodshed. That's actually a pretty decent gore effect, helped by the actor supposedly having a prosthetic leg. Eventually, two of Anne's hippie pals hunt the turkey monster down and attack him with machetes. But instead of the kill, we see a real turkey being beheaded, which I won't make you watch, and then an arty cut to this.
Oh my God. I've been hallucinating.
Yep, it was all a dream. Herschel admits to having been addicted to painkillers before any of this started. Angel helps cure his addictions by convincing him to finally let Jesus take the wheel, and he gets a happy drug-free ending with Anne. As for the narrator's parting thoughts, well, here they are. I swear this isn't an outtake, this is actually in the film, and again, they weren't joking.
So when you eat or take into your body any chemical or drugs, you take a chance on reactions that are untested, unpredictable. There are government agencies, many responsible groups, fighting the use of chemicals in the food we eat, the water we drink. And yet there are far too many of us who go right on taking the good way of life for granted, ignoring the warnings. So, let's give a little thought to making our own story have a happy ending.
Wow. But the story didn't end there. Remember that fire that nearly killed Hawks on the set of that Tarzan movie? Well, he claims that his life was saved by a lion who'd been trained to pull him to safety for another scene in the film. So when he retired from acting, he dedicated his attentions to running small-scale big cat sanctuaries in Florida. In 2004, those activities made international news headlines when a 600-pound tiger escaped from the actor's property and was shot by police, an act he described as unnecessary and murder. In 2012, more animals were confiscated from him over permit violations, but as of 2013, it appears he has regained them and hasn't made any further news. In any case, that's Blood Freak, and so concludes Schlocktober. Happy Halloween, everybody!